Abigail Harper signed the marriage papers with her hand shaking so badly the ink smeared across her name. She didn't cry. She had spent 34 years learning not to cry in public. Not when boys threw mud at her dress in the schoolyard. Not when women whispered behind their hands at church. Not when her own reflection reminded her every morning that the world had already decided what she was worth. She pressed the pen down hard, finished her signature, and told herself the same thing she always had: survive first. Feel later, if you must feel at all. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now and follow every part until the very end. Because this one does not end the way anyone expected. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Luke Callahan rode into Harwick to find himself a wife. 3 men outside the feed store watched him tie his horse to the post and laughed before he even opened his mouth. "There goes the last Callahan," one of them said loud enough to carry. "Riding into town to find a woman dumb enough to save a ranch that's already dead." Luke didn't stop walking. He had learned a long time ago that other men's laughter was just noise, and noise never fed cattle or paid the bank. The Callahan Ranch sat 8 miles east of Harwick, Wyoming, on land his father had broken himself out of, nothing but rock and stubbornness 40 years before. 3,000 acres of grazing land, a creek that ran clean through summer, a barn that had survived 2 blizzards, and a grass fire. It was supposed to be his inheritance. It was supposed to be the one solid thing in his life that could not be taken from him. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about most things that mattered. 3 years of drought had turned the grass to straw and the creek to a muddy trickle. The cattle prices had dropped so low that selling a full head barely covered the cost of the hay it took to keep it alive through winter. He had laid off 2 ranch hands the previous fall and worked the remaining land himself from before sunrise until after dark, and it still wasn't enough. The bank in Harwick held notes against the property that came due in 7 months, and the interest alone was more than he'd cleared in the last 12. But the debt wasn't even the worst of it. 3 weeks earlier, the family lawyer had ridden out from Cheyenne with a letter that had been sitting in a locked office drawer for 2 years, waiting for conditions that had apparently now been met. The letter was from his father. It was written in the same flat, deliberate hand that had signed every bill of sale and property deed the man had ever touched, and it said in plain language with no apology attached that the full title to Callahan Ranch would not transfer to Luke until he was married and had established what the lawyer called a stable household. If he remained unmarried at the end of 6 months from the date the letter was formally delivered, ownership would pass entirely to a man named Victor Hale, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity for years. Luke had stood on his porch that evening reading the letter 3 times, and each time he read it, he felt something cold settle deeper in his chest. Not grief, not rage. Something quieter than both. Something that felt like the slow recognition that the last wall you trusted had been hollow all along. He hadn't told anyone about the letter except his ranch foreman, a weathered man named Gus Abbott, who had worked the Callahan land since before Luke was born, and who received the news by spitting tobacco into the dirt and saying, "Well, your daddy always did believe in complicated solutions to simple problems." "It ain't simple," Luke said. "Marrying somebody generally is," Gus said. "It's everything that comes after that gets complicated." Luke had not responded to that. He had folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and spent the next 3 weeks trying to think of a single woman in Harwick County who might be willing to enter into a legal marriage with a man who had nothing to offer except a struggling ranch, an outstanding bank debt, and a personality that most people in town described as somewhere between a closed door and a stone wall. The answer he kept arriving at was not one he had expected. It was not one anyone in Harwick would expect either. He pushed through the door of the general store and found Horace Greer behind the counter, weighing out flour, and the 2 women standing near the fabric bolts stopped talking the moment he walked in. He recognized them both. He nodded once the way he nodded at everyone, without particular warmth or coldness, and moved to the counter. "Luke Callahan," Horace said, settling the weight. "You look like a man carrying something heavy." "Need some information," Luke said. "Abigail Harper. She's still living out on the old Whitmore Road." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. One of the women near the fabric bolts made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was clearly its close cousin. Horace Greer set down his scoop and looked at Luke with the careful expression of a man deciding how much to say. "She is," he said finally. "Been out there since her mother passed. Going on 8 months now. She working anywhere?" "Nowhere that I know of. She comes in for supplies once a week. Doesn't talk to many people." Horace paused. "Luke, I have to ask. Why are you asking about Abigail Harper?" "I have business with her," Luke said. He bought a bag of nails he didn't particularly need, put it under his arm and walked back out. Behind him he heard one of the women begin talking before the door had fully closed. He caught the word desperate and kept walking. King. Abigail Harper's house was small and sat back from the road behind a stand of cottonwood trees that had grown up wild around the property line. The porch boards sagged on one end, and the garden beside the front walk was overgrown but not dead. She had clearly been trying to keep it. Luke tied his horse at the gate and walked up the path. He knocked twice. The woman who opened the door was not what he had expected, though he wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. He had seen Abigail Harper in town, the way everyone in a small county eventually sees everyone else in passing from a distance without paying particular attention. She was 34 years old, broadly built, her weight carried solidly through her hips and shoulders, her face round and unguarded in the way that people's faces get when they have spent too many years alone to bother constructing defenses. She was wearing a plain gray dress and had flour on her left forearm, and was looking at him with an expression of complete and total wariness. "Mr. Callahan," she said. It was not a greeting. It was an identification. "Miss Harper," he said. "I'd like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the road, as if checking whether anyone had followed him out here to witness whatever was about to happen. "About what?" she said. "A business matter," he said. It would be better said, sitting down. Another long pause. Then she stepped back and held the door open. He followed her into a front room that was clean and spare with a wood table and 2 chairs and a shelf of books along the far wall that held more volumes than he would have expected. She did not offer him coffee. She sat down at one side of the table and folded her hands and looked at him without any expression he could read. He sat across from her and put his hat on the table between them. "I'm going to say this plainly," he said, "because I don't think you're a woman who does well with things said any other way." "That's a fair assumption," she said. "I need to be married within 6 months," he said. "It's a condition of my father's will. If I don't satisfy it, I lose the ranch to Victor Hale." She didn't move. She just watched him. "I'm not offering love," he said. "I want to be honest about that up front. What I'm offering is a legal arrangement. You'd have a home security, full access to the household finances, and my word that you'd be treated with basic respect. In return, I need a wife on paper and someone capable of managing the domestic side of the ranch while I work the land." The silence in the room lasted long enough that he heard the wind move through the cottonwoods outside. "You came to me," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "Not to marry Aldrin," she said. "Not to the Henderson girl. Not to anyone else in this county who is younger than me, lighter than me, and considerably more attached to the idea of being wanted." "No," he said. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I don't have time for negotiations," he said. "I don't have time for courtship rituals or someone's father deciding whether I'm suitable. I needed someone who would hear a proposition clearly and respond to it clearly. And I needed someone who would take the arrangement seriously and not be looking for a way out of it within the first season." She looked at him steadily. "You also needed someone no one else was competing with you for." "Yes," he said. "That too." She was quiet again. Outside, a horse somewhere down the road whinnied. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I have spent the last 6 years nursing my mother through an illness that eventually took everything she had, and most of what I had along with it. I have lived in this house alone for 8 months since she died. And in that time, exactly 2 people from this town have knocked on this door for reasons that were not related to selling me something. I know what I am to Harwick. I know what I look like. I know what people say." She unfolded her hands and laid them flat on the table. "I have exactly one condition." "Name it," he said. "You will treat me with dignity," she said. "Not affection, not performance. Dignity. You will not speak about me the way this town speaks about me. You will not look at me the way this town looks at me. Whatever this arrangement is inside your house and in front of your men, and in front of anyone in this county, I am treated as a person who has value. If you can give me that, and give me your word on it, I will marry you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. "You have my word," he said. She looked at his hand. Then she reached across and shook it. Her grip was firm. They married 12 days later in the county office with Gus Abbott and the court clerk as witnesses. No church, no guests, no celebration of any kind. The Harwick Courier ran a 2-line notice in the community column that Luke found tacked to the front wall of the feed store the following week, with a note someone had scrawled beneath it in pencil. She must have paid him. He pulled it off the wall and dropped it in the dirt without breaking his stride. The ranch hands received the news with varying degrees of confusion. There were 3 of them remaining on the property. Gus, who already knew and kept his opinion to himself. A younger man named Tom Briggs, who had been with the ranch 2 years and mostly minded his own business, and an older hand called Preach, so named because he quoted scripture when he was irritated, who heard the information and said only, "Well, the Lord works in ways that confuse lesser minds," which Luke chose to accept as neutral. Abigail arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning in a wagon with 2 trunks, a crate of books, and a cast-iron pot that she told Gus she would need help carrying into the kitchen. Gus helped her carry it. Nobody else offered. She did not ask for help with the trunks. Luke watched from the barn doorway as she unloaded them herself, moving with the steady, deliberate economy of someone who had been handling heavy things alone for a long time. She was wearing a brown dress and had her hair pinned back, and when she caught him watching, she gave him a single nod, the same nod he had given her in the general store, without warmth or coldness, just acknowledgement that they both existed in the same space. He went back to work. By the end of the first week, she had done 3 things that no one on that ranch had expected. The first was that she had gone through the household ledgers, not reorganized them, not tidied them. Gone through them the way a judge goes through evidence, every page, every entry, with a pencil in her hand and a piece of paper beside her that accumulated numbers as the day went on. On the 3rd day of that process, she came out to the barn where Luke was repairing a gate hinge and said without preamble, "Your feed supplier has been overcharging you for 14 months. He stopped working and looked at her. "By my count," she said, consulting the paper in her hand, "you have paid for approximately $240 worth of feed that was either underweighted or never delivered. I cross-referenced the order receipts against the delivery logs and the actual consumption records. There are gaps." She looked up at him. "I can show you exactly where." He set down the hinge. "Show me," he said. She showed him. It took the better part of an hour at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread out between them, and by the end of it, he was looking at a clear, organized accounting of money that had been quietly leaving his ranch for over a year without him realizing it. "How did you know to look for this?" he said. "My mother's doctor did something similar," she said simply. "Once you know what it looks like, you recognize the pattern." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You plan to do more of this?" "If you'll allow it." "I'll allow it," he said. She gathered the papers and went back inside. The second thing she did was fix the arrangement with the Hendry brothers, who ran the general hauling operation between the ranch and the stockyards, and who had for the past 2 years been taking a cut of the transport fees that was not reflected in any written agreement. Abigail found out about this through a conversation with Tom Briggs, who mentioned it offhandedly while she was asking about the general operation of the property. She asked him 3 follow-up questions, went back to the ledgers, confirmed what she suspected, and then wrote a letter to the Hendry brothers that Luke found on the kitchen table waiting for his signature. He read it twice. "This is direct," he said. "It needed to be," she said. "They're not going to like it." "They are not being asked to like it," she said. "They are being informed that the current arrangement will be corrected or the contract will be discontinued. I've included the specific figures and the legal basis for the renegotiation. If they want to argue, they can argue with the numbers." He signed the letter. 3 days later, the Hendry brothers came to the ranch in person, hats in hand, and agreed to revised terms. Gus watched the whole thing from the bunkhouse doorway, and afterward found Luke in the corral and said in the tone of a man making a factual observation rather than a compliment, "That woman has more nerve than most men I've worked with in 40 years." "I know," Luke said. "Good thing for this ranch," Gus said. "I know that too," Luke said. The third thing she did was quieter and harder to measure, and Luke didn't fully understand it until later. She began learning the ranch, not the bookkeeping, the actual land. She started asking Gus questions about the grazing patterns, about where the cattle moved in dry months, about which sections of the property held water longest. She walked the fence lines in the evenings after supper, not quickly, but carefully stopping when something caught her attention, crouching down sometimes to look at soil or grass, or the way a section of fence post had settled. She carried a small notebook in her apron pocket and wrote things in it that Luke never asked to see. Once, coming back from checking the eastern pasture, he found her standing at the edge of the north field with the notebook open, looking at the ground. "What are you looking at?" he said. She pointed down. There was a place in the grass near the fence where the ground was darker, slightly depressed. "There's water moving underground here," she said. "If this section were trenched correctly, you might be able to redirect some of it toward the holding pond before the dry season hits. I'm not certain. I'd need to talk to someone who knows the land survey." He looked at the ground, then at her. "Where'd you learn to read soil like that?" "Books mostly," she said. "My father had a large library. He believed women ought to understand the world they lived in." She closed the notebook. "I'm sorry if I've overstepped." "You haven't," he said. She put the notebook back in her pocket and walked back toward the house. He stood at the edge of that field for another few minutes, looking at the ground where she'd pointed, and then he went to find the old land survey. Harwick had opinions about all of this because Harwick always had opinions. The women at church discussed, when they thought they were not being overheard, whether Abigail Harper had somehow tricked Luke Callahan into the arrangement. The men at the feed store speculated largely, without information about how long before he came to his senses. Victor Hale, who owned the largest spread in the northern part of the county, and who had made no secret of his interest in the Callahan property, heard the news of the marriage and smiled in a way that suggested he wasn't particularly worried. Charlotte Bennett, who had grown up in Harwick before marrying a man from Denver and moving east, was not yet in the county. But she would be. Some things arranged themselves that way. What nobody in Harwick was watching closely enough to see was that a woman who had spent most of her life being made to feel like she took up too much space was quietly learning the shape of a ranch that had nearly broken under the weight of mismanagement and drought. And she was finding for the first time in years that she had more than enough to fill it. And the man who had married her for reasons that had nothing to do with love was coming home at the end of every day and sitting down to supper across from a woman who had something worth saying, and finding in ways he could not yet name that the walk from the barn to the house no longer felt like a walk toward nothing. He had not married for love. He had not expected to find anything except a solution. But something was growing in the margins of that arranged life, quiet and unremarked. The way the best things in dry country always do, not all at once, and not with any fanfare, but steadily, and with deep roots in the direction of water. The letter from the bank arrived on a Wednesday, and Abigail found it on the kitchen table, where Tom Briggs had left it after riding into Harwick for supplies. She didn't open it. That wasn't her place, and she knew it. But she could read the return address, and she could read the weight of the envelope, and she had been doing the ledgers long enough by then to understand what a letter that thick from the Harwick Territorial Bank usually contained. She put a pot of coffee on the stove and waited. Luke came in from the south pasture just before noon, pulled off his gloves, and saw the envelope. He stopped. Then he picked it up, broke the seal, and read it standing at the table without sitting down. Abigail kept her eyes on the stove. "They're calling in the secondary note," he said. She turned. "How much?" $412, due in 60 days. He set the letter down. "I don't have it." She wiped her hands on her apron and came to the table. She picked up the letter and read it herself all the way through, including the language in the second paragraph that Luke had probably skimmed past. "They've also added a penalty clause," she said. "If the payment is late by more than 14 days, they can accelerate the primary note, the full amount." "I know what accelerate means." "I know you do," she said quietly. She set the letter down. "Then we have 60 days to find $412 without touching the operating fund, because if we drain that, we won't make it through August." He looked at her. The word "we" had come out of her mouth the way a tool comes out of a hand that's been using it long enough that the reach is automatic. Neither of them mentioned it. "I've been thinking about the Delacroix cattle," he said. "There are 14 head running the eastern section that I bought off a bankruptcy sale 2 years ago. The market price is low, but if I move them now before the dry season hits and the weight drops, I might clear enough." "How much short would you be?" he thought. "Maybe $80. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have $93 in a savings account at the Cheyenne Bank. My mother's last money. I've been holding it because I didn't know what else to hold on to." She looked at the letter, not at him. "It's enough to cover the difference." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality than usual. "Abigail," he said. "It's not a gift," she said. "We can call it a loan against future household expenses. You can document it however you need to." She finally looked at him. "But 60 days is not a long runway, and I would rather we solve the immediate problem and argue about the method afterward." He stood there for a moment with his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize as his version of being moved by something he didn't know how to say. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She turned back to the stove. He picked up his gloves off the table and then put them down again. "Those $93, he said. "That was everything you had left from her." "Yes," she said. "I'll pay it back." "I know you will," she said. "Now go sell those cattle before the price drops another $1 a head." He went. The cattle sold in 4 days. Luke rode to Cheyenne himself, negotiated with 2 different buyers, and came back with more than he'd expected, because he'd had the presence of mind to wait out the first offer. Something he told Abigail over supper that he'd done on instinct, but that she recognized as the kind of patience that comes from finally having a reason to be careful. The banknote was paid with 11 days to spare. Abigail recorded the transaction in the ledger in her precise, even handwriting, and then she turned to the next page and started a new column because the banknote was solved, but the underlying problem was not. The ranch was still operating at a loss. The drought had not broken, and the 60 days they had just survived had cost them margin they didn't have to spare. She started working earlier in the mornings. Gus was the first one to notice. He came into the kitchen one morning before sunrise to get the coffee that she always had ready by the time the hands started their day, and found her already at the table with the ledgers and a fresh pot and a candle burning low beside her notebook. He poured himself a cup and stood there a moment, looking at the papers spread across the table. "You find something new," he said. "The cattle buyer in Cheyenne," she said. "Luke's been selling to him for 6 years. The price he's getting is consistent, but it's not competitive. There are 2 other buyers operating out of Laramie who are paying 8 to 12 cents more per hundredweight." She looked up. "That doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across a full season's sales." Gus was quiet for a moment. "Luke's got a relationship with that buyer." "I know," she said. "Relationships are worth something, but they shouldn't cost this much." She turned the notebook toward him so he could see the numbers. Over the last 3 seasons, the difference comes to somewhere between $250 and $300. That's not a relationship, that's a habit. Gus looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said, "You planning to tell him?" "When I have the full picture," she said. "I want to have the Laramie buyer information confirmed before I bring it to him. I'm writing to 2 contacts this week." Gus drained his coffee. "You know," he said in the tone of someone making a factual observation for the second time in 2 weeks. "Most people who come into a household like this spend the first 6 months finding their footing." He put the cup down. "You came in and started looking for holes in the floor on day 3. "The floor has holes," she said simply. "Someone had to look." He nodded once and went out to start the day. The letter from the Laramie buyers came back in 10 days, and the numbers were better than Abigail had estimated. She waited until a Sunday evening when the hands were in the bunkhouse, and Luke had come in late from riding the fence line and was sitting at the table with his boots still on, and the kind of exhaustion on his face that goes deeper than the body. She put a plate in front of him and sat down across from him with the notebook. "I want to show you something," she said. He looked at the notebook, then at the plate. He ate 3 bites first, which she had expected, and then he pulled the notebook toward him. She walked him through it methodically. The comparison between the Cheyenne buyer and the Laramie rates. The projected difference over a full selling season. The letters from the 2 Laramie operations, both of which had expressed interest in a regular supply arrangement. When she finished, he sat there with the notebook open in front of him and didn't say anything for a while. "I've been selling to Cole Morrison for 6 years, he said finally. "I know. He was selling to my father before that." "I know that too," she said. "And that relationship has real value. I'm not suggesting you end it. I'm suggesting you use it. If you bring him these numbers and tell him you've been approached by Laramie buyers, he may match the rate. He doesn't want to lose a supplier he's had for 20 years. And if he won't match it, then you have a decision to make with full information instead of half." Luke looked at the numbers again. Something moved across his face that she was learning to read the specific expression that appeared when she showed him something that was both obvious in retrospect and had somehow been invisible before she pointed at it. "When did you become so good at this?" he said. "I've been paying attention to money my whole life," she said. "When you don't have very much of it, you learn where it goes." He closed the notebook. "I'll ride to Cheyenne next week. Take the letters with you," she said. "Don't bluff. Just show him." He nodded. Then he looked at her across the table in the particular way he had started looking at her recently, not long, not openly, but with a quality of attention she didn't entirely know what to do with. "Abigail," he said. "Yes." He seemed to consider something. Then he said, "Thank you." "It's my job," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't, not this part." She looked down at the table. "Eat your supper before it gets cold," she said. He ate his supper. Cole Morrison matched the rate. Not the full difference, but close enough that Luke came home from Cheyenne with a revised contract, and the expression of a man who had just discovered the floor of a room he thought he knew was 3 inches higher than he'd been walking. Tom Briggs heard about it somehow, the way news moves on a small ranch through half-sentences, and the particular quality of a foreman's silence, and told Preach, who said, "The woman came in and started rearranging the furniture, and somehow the house is bigger now," which was the most poetic thing anyone on the Callahan Ranch had said in a decade. The hands had started calling her Miss Abigail, which had not been decided or announced, but had simply happened the way most forms of respect happen through accumulated small evidence that eventually becomes impossible to argue with. It was Tom who first came to her, directly bypassing Luke entirely when he found that the fence contractor they had hired for the north pasture repair had submitted a materials invoice that didn't match the lumber delivery record. He brought it to the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon and spread the 2 documents out and said, "Ma'am, I might be wrong, but these numbers don't agree with each other, and I don't know who to trust." Abigail looked at both documents for approximately 2 minutes. "You're not wrong," she said. "The invoice claims 64 posts were delivered. The delivery record shows 48. The difference is $11 and change. She looked up at Tom. Do you still have the original bid? Tom went to get it. He came back with a crumpled paper from his coat pocket, and she smoothed it out on the table and read it, and then she sat back. He underbid the job to get the contract, she said, then submitted the higher invoice, assuming nobody would check the delivery count against the original specification. She looked at Tom. Does Luke know this contractor personally? Not well, Tom said. He came recommended by someone at the feed store. Victor Hale's feed store, she said. Tom stopped. Yeah, he said slowly. Matter of fact. They looked at each other across the table. I'll write a letter to the contractor, she said. You don't need to mention this to anyone else yet. She paused. But Tom, I want you to start keeping account of any tradesmen or suppliers who come to this ranch who were referred by anyone connected to Hale. Don't confront anyone. Just keep a list and bring it to me. Tom looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded the way men nod when they recognize they are being organized by someone more methodical than themselves. Yes, ma'am, he said. Kappa. The list Tom brought her 2 weeks later had 4 names on it. She sat with it for 2 days before she said anything to Luke. She wanted to be sure she wasn't seeing a pattern that wasn't there. She went back through the ledgers, cross-referenced supplier contacts, looked at which contracts had been renegotiated or renewed in the last 3 years, and mapped it against the timeline of Victor Hale's increasing public interest in acquiring land in the eastern part of the county. What she found was not proof of anything a court would hear, but it was a clear, consistent picture of a man who had been quietly positioning the Callahan Ranch to fail, while appearing to have no connection to the outcome. She told Luke on a Friday evening, with the account book open and Tom's list beside it, and every document she had found arranged in order from least to most significant. Luke didn't interrupt her. He sat across the table and listened all the way through, and when she finished, he was quiet for longer than usual. How long has this been going on? He said. At minimum 2 years, she said. Possibly longer. Some of the early entries are ambiguous, but the pattern becomes clear starting around the time your father's health began to decline. Luke's jaw tightened. Hale knew about the will condition. Someone told him, she said. I don't know who, but he's been operating as though he knew the ranch would eventually be vulnerable, and he's been making it more vulnerable. I should ride over there and... No, she said firmly and without apology. That's exactly what he wants. A confrontation gives him leverage. A scene gives him a story to tell. If you ride over to Victor Hale's property and raise your voice by Monday morning, this county will have heard that Luke Callahan is falling apart under the pressure. She met his eyes. We don't give him that. We document everything. We close every gap he's been using, and we wait for him to make a move that we can answer in public with evidence. He stared at her. You've thought about this a lot. I've thought about nothing else for 2 weeks, she said. Something moved across his face again, that particular look, only this time it stayed a little longer than usual before he pulled it back. What do we do first? He said. We replace the fence contractor, she said. Quietly. We find new suppliers for anything on Tom's list. And you ride to the county registrar's office next week and request a formal copy of every water rights filing that touches your property line. All of them. Because if Hale is going to make a move, that's where it will come from. Luke leaned back. How do you know that? Because water is the only thing out here that matters more than land, she said. And you have a creek. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the side of the house with a low, steady sound. Abigail, he said. Yes. When you came here, he said slowly, when you agreed to this, did you know it was going to turn into this? She considered that honestly. I knew you were in trouble, she said. I didn't know how much or where all of it was coming from. But I've been paying attention since the first week. She folded her hands on the table. I had nothing else to do with my attention. I might as well put it somewhere useful. He looked at her for a long moment, not the quick glance she had grown accustomed to. A real sustained look, the kind that cost something to give. I owe you a debt I don't know how to calculate, he said. You don't owe me anything, she said. This ranch does well, I do well. It's the same interest. That's not why you're doing this. She didn't answer that. She closed the account book and stacked the papers and stood up from the table. I'll have the contractor letter ready for your signature in the morning, she said. She went to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment with her hand still on the latch. He was right. It wasn't only the same interest. It had stopped being only that somewhere around the third week in the margins of the ledgers in the evenings when he came home, and the kitchen was warm and there was food on the table, and he sat down across from her like a man who had forgotten how to stop moving until something gave him a reason to. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she was simply doing what she was capable of doing, filling a need, being useful, finally being seen as something other than a burden or a joke. But the truth was simpler than that and harder to carry. She had started wanting him to come home. Not because she needed him to, not because the arrangement required it, because when he walked through that door, the house had a different weight to it, and she had spent enough of her life in houses that were too quiet to pretend she didn't notice the difference. She let go of the latch. She went to bed. She lay there listening to the wind work against the walls of the house he had built, and the land she was learning, and the life that had started without either of them planning it to belong to both of them at once. Outside somewhere on the dark edge of the county, Victor Hale was making plans. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives in the pressure of things in the spaces between what people said and what they didn't. Whatever was coming, she intended to be ready for it. The water rights filing arrived at the county registrar's office on a Monday, and Luke didn't find out about it until Wednesday, when he rode into Harwick for a new set of bridle fittings, and the man behind the counter at the hardware store looked at him with the particular expression people wear when they know something you don't, and are deciding whether to be the one to tell you. You've seen the filing board at the registrar, the man said. Not recently, Luke said. Might want to, the man said. And that was all he said. Luke left the bridle fittings on the counter and walked 3 doors down to the registrar's office and read the posted filing twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly. Victor Hale had submitted a formal claim challenging the Callahan Ranch's senior water rights to Archer Creek, citing a survey discrepancy from 1871 that allegedly placed a portion of the creek's originating flow outside the original Callahan property boundary. If the claim held, Luke would lose access to the only reliable water source on his property. He rode home in the kind of controlled silence that in another man might have been rage, and in Luke Callahan was something colder and more deliberate. He came through the door and found Abigail at the table with the notebook, and he dropped the copy he'd made of the filing in front of her without a word. She read it. The whole thing. Then she read the second page. Then she looked up at him and said, "How old is the original survey?" 55 years, he said. It was done before Wyoming was a territory. The boundary markers were wooden posts. Half of them rotted out before my father bought the land. Do you have the original deed? In the strongbox, yes. Get it, she said. He got it. She spread it on the table beside the filing and read both documents simultaneously, moving her eyes between them with the focused expression she wore when she was working through numbers that didn't agree with each other. The discrepancy he's citing, she said. It refers to a survey marker at what the original deed calls the northeast corner of Section 4. Do you know where that is on the ground? I know every section of this property, he said. Is there water at that corner? He thought. There's a spring, seasonal. It feeds into the main creek about a quarter-mile downstream. That's what he's claiming, she said. He's arguing the spring is the originating source of your creek, and that the spring sits outside your boundary. If the spring is outside your boundary, the creek water downstream is not yours by senior right. She sat back. It's a clever argument. It's a fraudulent argument, Luke said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said. We need the land survey from 1871 and any subsequent surveys. We need them before the hearing date. She looked at the filing again. He's requested an expedited hearing. 30 days. 30 days, Luke repeated. Yes, she said. which means he's been preparing this for a long time, and he wants it resolved before you have time to build a proper defense. She folded her hands. Who did the last survey on this property? A man named Elias Vaught, out of Cheyenne. My father hired him in 1879. Is Vaught still working? I don't know. Find out tomorrow, she said. First thing. Luke looked at her across the table. Abigail, if we lose this hearing. We won't, she said. You don't know that. No, she said. But I know what's in these ledgers, and I know what's in that deed, and I know that a man who has to forge a claim using a rotted survey post from 55 years ago is a man who doesn't have a legitimate argument. She met his eyes. He's counting on you not having time to prove it. So we don't waste time. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. Luke, she said. He turned at the door. Don't talk about this in town, she said. Not yet. He has people listening. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded again and went out. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in her room with the deed and the water rights filing both memorized and turned the argument over from every angle she could find, looking for the weakness in Hale's claim that would be cleanest to attack in a public forum. Because that was what this was going to be, a public forum. A county hearing in front of people who had spent months waiting for the Callahan Ranch to fail, and a man who had spent years building toward this exact moment. She thought about what it would mean to stand up in front of those people. She thought about what they saw when they looked at her. She got up before dawn and made coffee and went back to work. Elias Vaught was still alive and still working out of Cheyenne, and Luke tracked down a current address through a contact at the Territorial Land Office in 3 days. He wrote immediately, and Abigail wrote a second letter the same evening that was more specific about what they needed, including a request that Vaught locate his original field notes from the 1879 survey. Not just the final document, because field notes would contain the actual measurements and reference points that a final survey sometimes compressed into shorthand. Vaught wrote back in 8 days. He had the field notes. He remembered the Callahan survey. And he said something in his letter that Abigail read 3 times before she brought it to Luke. He says the 1871 survey Hale is citing was contested at the time, she said. There was a boundary dispute between your father and the man who owned the land to the north before Hale bought it. The dispute was resolved in your father's favor in 1873. There should be a court record. Luke stared at her. I never knew that. Your father may not have told you, she said. Or you were too young to remember. She set the letter down. But if that court record exists and establishes the spring as being within your boundary, Hale's entire claim collapses. He's arguing a boundary that was legally settled 20 years before he bought the neighboring land. He knew, Luke said quietly. Yes, she said. He knew. He bought that land knowing the dispute existed, and he's been waiting for a moment when you were weak enough that you might not dig back far enough to find the resolution. She looked up. We need that court record. Cheyenne Courthouse, Luke said. He was already standing. Take Tom with you, she said. And Luke, whatever you find, don't tell anyone else what it is until the hearing. Let him think he still has the advantage. Luke looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that she had stopped trying to categorize. You think like a lawyer, he said. I think like someone who has been underestimated her whole life, she said. It teaches you to hold your cards until the right moment. He left for Cheyenne the following morning. He was gone 4 days. During those 4 days, Charlotte Bennett arrived in Harwick. Abigail heard about it from Gus, who mentioned it the way Gus mentioned things he considered potentially important, but was not sure how to raise, which was obliquely, and while doing something else. He came into the kitchen on the second morning after Luke had left, and poured himself coffee, and said without looking at her, Charlotte Ashworth is back in town. She married a man named Bennett out of Denver 6 years back. He passed last winter. Abigail was writing a letter to the county registrar. She kept writing. I see, she said. She was asking after Luke, Gus said. Abigail finished the sentence she was writing. That's understandable, she said. They were close once. Gus was quiet for a moment. She's staying at the Harwick Hotel, he said. People are talking. People in Harwick talk about everything, Abigail said. They're saying she came back because she heard the ranch was turning around. Abigail put her pen down. She looked at the letter she'd been writing. Then she picked the pen back up. Gus, she said, when Luke gets back from Cheyenne, we have a water rights hearing to prepare for. That's the only thing that matters right now. Gus drank his coffee. Yes, ma'am, he said, and he went out. She sat there for a moment after he left with her pen in her hand and the letter half finished in front of her, and something cold and familiar moving through her chest. She knew what it was. She had felt it before many times in different forms. It was the specific sensation of remembering that the ground you thought you'd found was borrowed. She had not built a fantasy. She had told herself that from the beginning. This was an arrangement. Luke Callahan had married her for the ranch, and she had agreed because she had nowhere else to be and nothing else to be wanted for. She had told herself that every day for 5 months. She had almost believed it. She went back to the letter. Luke came back from Cheyenne on the 5th day with Tom Briggs beside him and a leather satchel across his saddle that he brought directly to the kitchen table before he even took off his coat. He pulled out a document. Thick official sealed with the territorial court stamp from 1873. It exists, he said. His voice was different, tighter, like a man who has been holding something in for 4 days. The court ruling. It's exactly what Vaught described. The 1873 boundary settlement specifically established that the spring at the northeast corner of Section 4 lies within the Callahan property as originally filed. The ruling is signed by a territorial judge and recorded in the Laramie County Courthouse records. He spread it on the table. Hale's claim is built on a boundary dispute that was legally closed before he ever owned his land. Abigail looked at the document. She read the key passages. Then she sat back. He knew, she said again, but this time it came out differently. Harder. He absolutely knew, Luke said. Tom found 2 other land transactions Hale has been involved in over the last decade. Same pattern. Find an old disputed boundary. Wait for the landowner to be vulnerable. File a claim, collect a settlement, or force a sale. He's done this before, she said. Twice that we found, Tom said from the doorway. Both times the landowner didn't have the resources to fight it. Both times Hale ended up with the water rights and the land sold cheap inside a year. Abigail looked at the 1873 ruling, then at the water filing, then at her notebook. Something was assembling itself in her mind, the full shape of what Victor Hale had been building, and it was larger than she had understood before. We can't just present this at the hearing and call it done, she said. Luke looked at her. Why not? Because winning the hearing protects the ranch, she said. But it doesn't stop him. He'll find another angle, another filing, another supplier on Tom's list. She tapped the 1873 document. But if we go into that hearing with this ruling, and the evidence of the other 2 cases, and we present it in front of the full county as a pattern of deliberate fraud, not just a mistake, not just an aggressive land claim, but a systematic scheme to defraud vulnerable landowners, then we're not just winning a hearing. She looked up at him. We're ending his ability to do this to anyone else. The kitchen was very quiet. Tom said from the doorway, She's right. Luke looked at Abigail. That's a bigger fight, he said. Yes, she said. But you have the evidence, and you have 30 days. She held his gaze. The question is, whether you want to stop him or just survive him. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then something settled in his face, a decision landing the way decisions land when a person stops calculating and just commits. I want to stop him, he said. Then we have a lot of work to do, she said. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. They worked every evening for 2 weeks. Abigail organized the evidence into a sequence that told the story of Hale's scheme from beginning to end, starting with the oldest documentation and building forward, each piece connecting to the next in a chain that a room full of ordinary people could follow without legal training. She wrote a formal summary that ran to 12 pages and had Luke read it through without the papers in front of him, because she knew that in a public hearing, the man who spoke clearly and directly landed harder than the man who shuffled through documents. She contacted the families from Hale's 2 previous cases. One didn't respond. The other, a widow named Mrs. Geary, who had lost her water rights and sold her land to Hale 4 years earlier for less than half its value, wrote back in a shaking hand and said she would come to the hearing if someone could arrange her transport. Abigail arranged it herself, from her own remaining money, without telling Luke. She was building a case. She was doing what she was capable of doing. She was useful, and being useful was the one thing in her life she had never had to apologize for. She told herself that was enough. It was Charlotte Bennett who made that harder to believe. Luke had not mentioned her. Abigail had not mentioned her. But Charlotte had apparently been asking around town about Luke's schedule, and on a Thursday afternoon, while Luke was in the north pasture, and the hands were at the far fence line, a hired buggy came up the ranch road and stopped in front of the house. Abigail was on the porch with the 12-page summary in her lap when Charlotte Bennett stepped down from the buggy. She was everything Harwick said she was. Tall, composed, wearing a traveling dress that cost more than Abigail's entire wardrobe. Her face was the kind of face that photographers wanted symmetrical and certain of itself. She looked at Abigail on the porch, and something moved across her expression. Not unkindness exactly, but the specific form of surprise that appears when the world is smaller than expected. "Mrs. Callahan," she said with a smile that was almost warm. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Charlotte Bennett. I'm an old friend of Luke's." "I know who you are," Abigail said. Charlotte came up the porch steps without being invited. "I heard about the water rights trouble," she said. "I wanted to offer my sympathies. Victor Hale is a difficult man." "He is," Abigail said. "I also wanted to call on Luke," Charlotte said. "Just to say hello. We were close once." "He's working," Abigail said. "He'll be working until supper." Charlotte looked at the papers in Abigail's lap. "Is that the hearing preparation?" "Yes," Abigail said. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "You're handling all of that yourself." "Luke and I are handling it together," Abigail said. "I do the preparation. He does the presentation. It seems to be working." Something shifted in Charlotte's expression. Not hostility. Something more uncomfortable than that, the look of a person revising a calculation they thought was already finished. "You're not what I expected," Charlotte said. And she said it in a way that was almost honest. "Most people aren't," Abigail said. "When you're ready to leave your card, I'll make sure Luke knows you called." Charlotte held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her bag, left a small card on the porch railing, and went back down to the buggy. Abigail watched the buggy go down the road until it turned at the bend. Then she looked down at the summary in her lap and found the paragraph she'd been checking when the buggy arrived and went back to reading. Her hands were not quite steady. She made them steady. She kept reading. Luke found Charlotte's card on the porch railing when he came in that evening. He picked it up, looked at it, set it down on the table in the front room without a word. Abigail was already at the kitchen table with supper ready and the hearing documents in their organized stack to one side. He sat down. She served the food. They went through the hearing plan for the 14th time, Luke walking through the sequence from memory while she followed along and noted 2 places where the transition between evidence pieces needed a cleaner connecting statement. When they were done, he looked at the card, still sitting in the front room. "She came by today," he said. "Yes," Abigail said. "What did she want?" "She said she wanted to say hello," Abigail said. She also looked at the hearing preparation and seemed surprised that it existed. Luke was quiet. "Did she say anything else?" "Nothing that matters right now," Abigail said. She closed the notebook. "The hearing is in 16 days. Mrs. Geary's transport is confirmed. Vaught has agreed to appear as a technical witness. The 1873 ruling is certified." She stacked the papers. "We're ready." He looked at her across the table. The card was in the front room, and the hearing was 16 days away, and the ranch was either going to survive or it wasn't. And he was sitting across from a woman who had spent 5 months holding things together with both hands, while the world waited for her to fail. And something in his expression had been shifting for weeks into something that didn't have a clean word for it yet. "Abigail," he said. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow I want to ride the north section with you and look at that spring again before the hearing. I want to be able to describe it from memory if anyone asks." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He went to bed. She sat at the table alone for a while, after in the quiet house that had become without either of them deciding it something that felt dangerously close to home. 16 days. Whatever came after, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else in her life. With both hands and whatever was left of her heart. The morning of the hearing, Abigail was up 2 hours before dawn. She didn't wake Luke. She didn't need to. She sat at the kitchen table with the full document stack in front of her and went through every page one final time, not because she had forgotten anything, but because she needed to feel the weight of it in her hands before she walked into that room. The 1873 court ruling. Elias Vaught's field notes. The certified copies of Hale's 2 previous water claims in other counties. Mrs. Geary's written testimony. The organized ledger extracts showing the pattern of supplier interference. 12 pages of summary that she had rewritten 4 times until every sentence was as clean and direct as she could make it. She stacked them in order. She tied them with a cord. She set them by the door. Then she made coffee and biscuits and waited. Luke came out at first light already dressed and stopped when he saw the stack by the door. "You've been up a while," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. He poured coffee and sat down across from her, and they ate without talking much, which had become one of the things she valued most about being in a room with him. He didn't fill silence with noise. He let it be what it was. "You ready?" he said when they were done. "Yes," she said. "Are you nervous?" She considered lying. "Yes," she said again. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Means you understand what's at stake." She looked at him. "That's an unusual thing to say." "My father told me that once," he said, "before the first time I had to negotiate a cattle contract on my own. I was 17. I told him I was nervous, and he said good, and I thought he was being cruel." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Later, I understood he meant that nervous people pay attention, and paying attention is the only advantage a man has in a room full of people who want something from him." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was complicated." "He was," Luke said. "He was also usually right, which made the complicated parts harder to argue with." He finished his coffee and stood. "Let's go." The county hearing room in Harwick held perhaps 60 people when full. When Luke and Abigail walked through the door at 9 in the morning, it held 83, because the word had spread the way word always spreads in a small county, not through official channels, but through the particular velocity of a story that people find irresistible. Luke Callahan's water rights. Victor Hale's challenge. The failing ranch that had apparently stopped failing. And the wife nobody had expected. People moved to look when they came in. Abigail felt it the way she always felt a room's attention, like a temperature change, like something tightening in the air around her. She kept her eyes forward, and her chin level, and her grip on the document stack steady. Victor Hale was already seated at the petitioner's table, flanked by a lawyer from Cheyenne in a good suit, who had the easy posture of a man accustomed to winning in rooms like this. Hale himself was broad and silver-haired, and wore the particular expression of a man who has already decided how the day will end. He looked at Luke when they entered. Then his gaze moved to Abigail, and he smiled briefly with the kind of confidence that is actually contempt dressed in better clothes. She had expected that. She had prepared for that. She set the document stack on the respondent's table and sat down beside Luke and opened the top folder. Mrs. Geary was already seated in the witness row, A thin woman in her 60s, with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since she arrived, but whose eyes were clear, and whose jaw was set in the way of someone who had decided to be present even when presence cost something. Abigail had spoken with her for an hour the previous evening, and knew that what she carried was not just testimony, but 4 years of anger that had nowhere to go until now. Elias Vaught sat beside her, white-haired and deliberate, with his original field notebook in his coat pocket, and the expression of a man who took surveying seriously enough to travel 2 days to correct a misrepresentation of his own work. The hearing commissioner, a man named Aldred, who Abigail had researched carefully and found to be methodical and impatient with theatrics, called the room to order at 9:15. Hale's lawyer went first. He was good. Abigail gave him that. He presented the 1871 survey with clean confidence, had a drafted map displayed on an easel that showed the disputed spring sitting clearly outside the Callahan boundary line, and spoke for 20 minutes in the smooth, unhurried voice of a man who knows the other side isn't ready. He called the discrepancy a matter of historical record. He called Hale's claim a straightforward legal correction of a long-standing boundary error. He used the word straightforward 4 times, which Abigail noted because people who use a word that many times are usually trying to prevent you from looking at the thing the word is supposed to describe. When he finished, Commissioner Aldred turned to Luke. Luke stood. He did not have notes in front of him. Abigail had insisted on that. Notes made a man look uncertain. He had the sequence memorized. "Commissioner," he said, "before we address the 1871 survey Mr. Hale's counsel has presented, I'd like to introduce a document that predates today's proceeding by 17 years. He placed the certified copy of the 1873 Territorial Court ruling on the commissioner's table. The sound that went through the room was small and significant. Hale's lawyer straightened in his chair. Hale himself went very still. "This is the ruling issued by Territorial Judge Harmon Fletcher in March of 1873. Luke said, resolving a boundary dispute between my father James Callahan and the previous owner of the land now held by Victor Hale. The dispute concerned precisely the boundary Mr. Hale's counsel has raised today, including the location of the spring at the northeast corner of Section 4. Judge Fletcher's ruling established clearly and on the record that the spring lies within the Callahan property boundary as originally filed." He paused. "Mr. Hale purchased his land in 1881. That is 8 years after this ruling was recorded in the Laramie County Courthouse, where it remains on file today. Anyone conducting proper title research on that property would have found this ruling before the purchase was completed." The room had gone the kind of quiet that has texture. Commissioner Aldred was reading the ruling. His expression did not change, but his reading slowed in the way that reading slows when something is landing. Hale leaned toward his lawyer and said something in a low voice. The lawyer's response was brief and did not appear to be reassuring. "Continue," Commissioner Aldred said to Luke. "Commissioner Aldred, I'd also like to call Elias Vaught." Luke said, "who conducted the 1879 survey of the Callahan property and whose field notes directly contradict the boundary interpretation presented by Mr. Hale's counsel." Vaught came to the front of the room and testified for 15 minutes in the precise, unhurried language of a man who has been doing this for 40 years and has no interest in embellishment. He explained with reference to his original field notes exactly how the boundary had been measured, where the reference points had been set, and why the 1871 survey being used by Hale contained a known transcription error that had been identified and corrected in the 1873 proceeding. He used the word error 3 times, and each time he said it, he looked at Hale the way a man looks at something he finds professionally offensive. When Vaught finished, one of the older men in the back of the room said to no one in particular, "Well, that seems pretty clear." Hale's lawyer stood and objected to the characterization of his client's claim as based on a known error. Commissioner Aldred told him to sit down. Luke looked at Abigail. She gave him a single nod. He turned back to the commissioner. "I'd like to present one additional body of evidence," he said, "which concerns not this specific filing, but a pattern of similar filings by Victor Hale in 2 other Wyoming counties over the past decade." The room shifted. It was a physical thing, the collective movement of 83 people adjusting their weight. Hale's lawyer was on his feet immediately. "Commissioner, this is irrelevant to the matter before." "Sit down," Commissioner Aldred said again with slightly more emphasis. Luke placed the evidence packets on the table. 2 cases, 2 landowners, 2 water rights challenges built on disputed historical surveys. Both resolved in Hale's favor because the landowners had lacked the resources to fight. In 1884, Luke said, Mrs. Dorothea Geary of Carbon County lost her water rights to a creek that had served her family's property for 22 years. The challenge was based on an 1869 survey boundary discrepancy that Mr. Hale's legal representation at the time argued could not be verified due to the age of the original markers. He paused. "Mrs. Geary is here today." Every head in the room turned toward the witness row. Mrs. Geary sat with her shaking hands folded in her lap and her chin up and looked back at the room with 4 years of quiet fury in her eyes. "Following the ruling against her," Luke continued, "Mrs. Geary's property value declined significantly due to the loss of reliable water access. She sold the land 18 months later to a buyer acting on Mr. Hale's behalf at a price approximately 40% below assessed value." He looked at the commissioner. "The second case follows an almost identical sequence. I have the documentation for both." He placed the files on the commissioner's table. The room was no longer quiet in the textured way it had been before. It was loud with the specific noise of people turning to each other and saying things in low, urgent voices that added up to one collective recognition. This was not a boundary dispute. This was a system. Commissioner Aldred spent 4 minutes reading. Then he looked up at Victor Hale with an expression that had moved entirely past professional neutrality. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I'd like to hear from you directly." Hale stood. He had the bearing of a man who has spent decades in rooms like this and knows how to wait out a bad moment. "Commissioner," he said, "the cases Mr. Callahan has referenced were resolved through proper legal proceedings and have no bearing. They were resolved," Commissioner Aldred said, "because the respondents lacked sufficient resources to mount an adequate defense. That is not the same as resolution on the merits." He set the files down. "I have before me a certified 1873 territorial court ruling that directly addresses the boundary you are challenging today. I have technical testimony from the surveyor of record contradicting your supporting evidence, and I have documentation suggesting that this type of challenge on this type of basis is not a novel occurrence for your legal team." He looked at Hale for a long moment. "Do you have anything substantive to offer in response to the 1873 ruling?" Hale's lawyer stood. "Commissioner, we would request additional time to review." "How much time did you need to prepare this challenge?" Commissioner Aldred said. Silence. "That's what I thought," the commissioner said. He looked at the room. "This hearing is adjourned. I will issue a formal ruling within 5 business days, but I will tell this room plainly that the evidence presented today raises questions that go significantly beyond the scope of a water rights determination. I will be forwarding the pattern documentation to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review." He picked up the gavel. "Mr. Hale, I would strongly advise you to retain counsel who specializes in fraud defense." The gavel came down. The room erupted. It was not orderly. People stood. People turned people, pushed toward the Callahan table, and away from Hale's, and somewhere in the middle of that, Abigail sat very still with her hands flat on the document stack and felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something that felt like the particular relief of having carried a very heavy thing a very long distance and finally being allowed to set it down. Gus appeared from somewhere in the crowd and gripped Luke's shoulder and said nothing, which was Gus's version of profound emotion. Tom Briggs was shaking someone's hand. Mrs. Geary was being helped to her feet by Elias Vaught, and she was crying the silent kind of crying that comes from something finally being said that has been unsaid for too long. Luke turned from the room and looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. Around them, the room was loud and moving, and he stood still in the middle of it and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open in a way his face was not usually open, as if something had come down that had been up for a very long time. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "Abigail." "Luke, there are 40 people trying to talk to you right now." "I know," he said. He didn't look at any of them. "I just need you to hear something first." She waited. "When I came to your house 6 months ago," he said, "I told you I was offering a business arrangement. I told you I wasn't offering love." He stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I understood what I was saying when I said it. And I want you to know that I no longer understand it at all." The noise of the room was around them on all sides. She looked at him. She did not let herself look away. "We should get through today first," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands under the table were not. He nodded. Once. The way he always nodded when he accepted something that required patience. But he didn't look away either. It took 2 hours to leave the hearing room. People stopped Luke constantly. Neighbors who had watched from a distance for months. Ranchers who had quietly worried about Hale's expanding influence. 2 men who asked specifically about the pattern documentation and whether copies were available. Commissioner Aldridge shook Luke's hand on the way out and said low enough that only Luke heard, "Your wife put that presentation together, didn't she?" It was not quite a question. "She did," Luke said. The commissioner nodded slowly. "Tell her it was the clearest legal argument I've seen presented by a non-lawyer in 20 years on this bench." He walked away. Luke found Abigail outside, standing with Mrs. Geary, who was holding Abigail's hand, with both of her shaking ones, and talking quietly. He stood back and watched. Abigail was listening, with the full attention she gave everything, not half present, not managing genuinely there, and whatever she said back made Mrs. Geary close her eyes briefly and nod. He stood there watching and felt something settle in him. Not like a decision, like a recognition. The kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives fully formed, as if it had been on its way for a long time and had only just now found the door. On the way home, they rode mostly in silence. The sky was wide and the road was empty, and the ranch was 8 miles away, and everything between them felt different, and neither of them had yet found the language for how. It was Abigail who spoke first, and what she said was not what he expected. "Charlotte came to the hearing," she said. He glanced at her. "I know. I saw her." "She left early," Abigail said, before the commissioner made his final statement. He was quiet for a moment. "I noticed." "She's a beautiful woman," Abigail said. Her voice was careful. Not wounded, just careful the way her voice got when she was saying something that cost her something to say. "She is," Luke said. "And she knew you before any of this," Abigail said. "Before the debt and the drought and the arrangements." "Abigail," he said. "I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty," she said. "I'm saying it because you should know that I understand the difference between what we arranged and what a man might actually want. And I don't expect—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "Charlotte came to my house 2 days after she arrived in Harwick," he said. "She came while you were in town at the registrar's office. She sat in my front room and she told me she'd made a mistake 10 years ago and she wanted to know if there was still something worth discussing." Abigail said nothing. Her hands were still on the reins. "I told her no," he said. The road went under them for a moment. "Just no," Abigail said. "I told her that I was married," he said, "and that the word meant something to me." He paused. "She asked me if it was real, the marriage, and I told her that I didn't know how to answer that yet, but that whatever it was the realest thing in my life right now, and I wasn't interested in anything that would put it at risk." Abigail kept her eyes on the road ahead. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know how to tell you that I had chosen you, without knowing how to say that I had chosen you." The horses moved. The road was long. The sky was the particular blue of late afternoon in Wyoming that goes all the way to the edge of everything. "Luke," she said finally, Yes, I put those $93 in, she said slowly. The last of my mother's money, and I did it because the ranch needed it. That's what I told myself. She paused. But that wasn't why. He looked at her. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of you losing this place, she said. And I didn't want to look at that too closely, because it meant something I wasn't ready to mean. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different silence than the one they'd started with. Warmer, more crowded. Full of the things that had been said and the things that were still finding their way to the surface patient as water moving toward daylight through solid ground. The ranch was quiet when they arrived. Gus and the hands had come back ahead of them and made themselves scarce with the particular tact of men who understood more than they let on. The house was empty. Luke brought the horses in. Abigail went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the table where the Ledgers lived and the shelf where her books had gradually taken up residence alongside the few volumes Luke's father had left behind. She thought about the woman who had signed her name with a shaking hand 6 months ago. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself, about what was possible, about what she was worth. She put the kettle on. Luke came in from the barn 15 minutes later and found her at the table with 2 cups and the notebook closed for the first time in weeks. He sat down across from her. She pushed a cup toward him. He wrapped his hands around it, looked at the closed notebook, looked at her. Commissioner Aldred told me. He said that your hearing presentation was the clearest legal argument he'd seen from a non-lawyer in 20 years. She blinked. He said that, word for word, Luke said, I thought you should know. She looked down at the closed notebook. Something moved across her face, that she couldn't quite contain a small undoing, the specific kind that happens when you hear a thing you have wanted to hear for so long, you had stopped believing anyone would ever say it. Abigail, he said quietly. She looked up. You are the most capable person I have ever known, he said. And I have been watching you work yourself to the bone for 6 months on behalf of something that was not yours when you arrived, and I want you to know that I see it. All of it. Every ledger. Every letter. Every night you stayed up when you thought I was asleep. He stopped, set down the cup. I don't know how to do this correctly, he said. I have not had much practice with the truth in this particular direction, but I know that this house is different because of you. And I know that I am different because of you. And I know that whatever I thought I was getting when I knocked on your door 6 months ago, it was not this. And I would not trade this for anything I thought I wanted before. She sat very still. That is not a business statement, he said. No, she said. It isn't. I'm aware I'm not saying it correctly. You're saying it fine, she said. Her voice had gone soft in a way it almost never did. He looked at her across the table that had become the center of a life neither of them had planned. Outside, somewhere on the property that was no longer just his, the creek ran on in the dark, undisputed, following the same course it had always followed, steady and certain, and exactly where it belonged. The formal ruling came on a Thursday, 5 days after the hearing, delivered by a rider from the county office, who handed Luke an envelope at the barn door and tipped his hat and left without a word. Luke didn't open it right away. He stood there with it in his hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of everything that had led to this exact moment. 3 years of drought, 6 months of Abigail, a creek that had run clean through all of it. He walked to the house. Abigail was at the table. She looked up when he came in and saw the envelope and went very still. He sat down. He opened it. He read it once. Then he slid it across the table to her. She read it. Her eyes moved carefully down the page, the way they always moved when she was reading something that mattered, without rushing, without skipping all the way to the end. Then she set it down. It's over, she said. It's over, he said. The ruling was complete and unambiguous. The Callahan Ranch retained full senior water rights to Archer Creek and all tributary sources, including the Northeast Spring. Victor Hale's challenge was denied on the basis of the 1873 Territorial Court precedent. Commissioner Aldred had added a formal notation at the bottom of the ruling stating that the documentation of similar proceedings in Carbon and Sweetwater counties had been forwarded in full to the Territorial Attorney General's office, and that an inquiry was ongoing. Hale was not finished, not legally, but he was finished here, and everyone in Harwick County would know it by Monday. Luke looked at the ruling on the table between them. Then he looked at Abigail. She was looking at the document with an expression he had seen before, the one she wore when something she had worked very hard for finally arrived. Not elation, not relief exactly, but a kind of quiet reckoning. The expression of a woman taking in a moment she had earned and allowing herself carefully to believe it was real. "You should feel proud of yourself," he said. She looked up. "We should," she said. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not being modest, Abigail. I know what I contributed, and I know what you contributed, and they are not the same thing. I rode to Cheyenne. I stood up in that room. But you built the case that made standing up worth something." He held her gaze. "Let yourself have it." She was quiet for a moment. Then very softly she said, "All right." It was the first time he had ever heard her accept a compliment without deflecting it immediately, and it felt like something opening. The news moved through Harwick the way he had predicted it would, with the velocity of things people have been waiting to say. By Friday evening, 3 different neighbors had ridden out to the ranch to offer their congratulations. By Saturday, the story had expanded in the retelling to include details that hadn't happened, which Luke recognized as the town's way of making a story its own. What was true was enough. Victor Hale had filed a fraudulent water claim against a struggling ranch. The ranch's wife had uncovered the fraud, organized the evidence, and presented it in a public hearing that ended with the Territorial Attorney General's office opening an inquiry into Hale's land dealings across 3 counties. Abigail Harper, who the town had called the Old Maid for as long as anyone could remember, had walked into a county hearing room and quietly dismantled the most powerful land speculator in the region. The women who had whispered in the fabric section of Horace Greer's general store did not stop talking about her. But what they said changed. Abigail didn't know what to do with that at first. She had spent so many years knowing exactly what rooms felt like when she walked into them, the small adjustments people made, the looks that happened a fraction of a second before they could be controlled. She had built her entire interior life around not needing those looks to be different. It took her a while to learn how to walk into a room where they were. It was Gus who said it plainly, the way Gus said everything without ornamentation and without particular gentleness. He came into the kitchen on the Monday after the ruling and poured his coffee and said, "Preach wants me to tell you that he believes the Lord has a sense of humor, and that the evidence for this is the fact that the woman this town wrote off as nothing turned out to be the thing that saved it from losing one of its best ranches to a thief." Abigail looked at him. "That's a very long message from Preach." "He had a lot of feelings," Gus said. "I condensed." She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to the full, unguarded kind she had mostly kept to herself for years, and Gus looked at it with the expression of a man witnessing something he was glad to see. He drank his coffee and went back out without saying anything else. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, still feeling the laugh in her chest, still surprised by it, and thought about the woman who had sat in a small house on the Whitmore Road 8 months ago and told herself that surviving was enough. She had been wrong about that. Surviving was the floor, not the ceiling. It was Tom Briggs who brought the news about Hale 3 weeks later. He came in from Harwick on a Tuesday with his hat in his hand and the look of a man carrying something significant and uncertain how to hold it. "Hale's selling," he said. Luke looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What do you mean selling?" "His whole operation. The Northern spread the timber rights, the grazing leases, all of it." Tom turned his hat in his hands. "Word is, the Attorney General's inquiry found enough to bring charges. His lawyer advised him to liquidate and settle before it goes to a full proceeding." He paused. "He's leaving Wyoming." The barn was quiet for a moment. "Who told you this?" Luke said. "Morrison, the cattle buyer. He heard from the land agent handling the sale. Tom hesitated. There's something else. The two families Hale took the water rights from in the other counties, Carbon and Sweetwater. Apparently, the inquiry is looking at whether those rulings can be revisited. Luke set down the harness. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked to the house. He found Abigail in the side garden she had put in during the spring, the one she had started from seeds she'd ordered from a catalog, and tended every morning before the rest of the house was awake. She was crouching over a row of something green and low and did not hear him come out. "Tom brought news," he said. She stood and turned. He told her. All of it. Hale liquidating. The inquiry's scope. The possibility of revisiting the previous rulings. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the garden for a moment without speaking. "Mrs. Geary?" she said. "I know," he said. "We need to write to her today," she said. "She should hear it from us before she hears it from anyone else." "Already thinking the same thing," he said. She nodded. Then she looked at him with the particular expression she wore when something large was passing through her that she was not going to say out loud, and he had learned by now to let that expression do what it needed to do without rushing it. "It's not enough to undo what he did to her," she said finally. "No," he said. "It isn't. But it's something." "It's a great deal," he said. She pulled off her garden gloves and held them in one hand. "We should have Vaught's field notes copied and filed with the county permanently," she said, "so that if anyone ever tries to challenge this boundary again, it's already on record in a form that can't be disputed." He looked at her. "You're already thinking about the next thing." "I'm always thinking about the next thing," she said. "It's a character flaw." "It's the reason this ranch is still standing," he said. She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to it, and he looked back at her in the way he had been looking at her for weeks, openly now without pulling it back. "Come inside," she said. "I'll write the letter to Mrs. Geary. You should write to Vaught." "All right," he said. She started toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked together with the easy, unconscious coordination of two people who have learned each other's pace without deciding to. Summer moved into the ranch the way it always did in Wyoming, suddenly and completely, and the drought that had been grinding the land for 3 years broke in late June, with 3 days of hard, steady rain that filled the holding pond and brought the creek up and turned the east pasture from straw-colored to something closer to what grass was supposed to look like. Luke stood on the porch the morning after the rain stopped and looked at the land and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not just relief, something larger, something that had to do with the future tasting different than it had. Abigail came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and stood beside him and looked at the same land. "The north section might actually sustain a second herd this season," she said. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "Tom's been asking about taking on more responsibility," she said. "He's ready. If we expand, he should be offered a formal foreman position." "I'll talk to him this week," he said. They stood there drinking coffee in the morning air that was clean and cool after the rain, and the land stretched out from them in every direction with the particular quality of things that have survived a hard season and come out the other side still standing. "Abigail," he said. I want to ask you something." She turned and looked at him. He turned and looked at her. He had the expression he wore when he was going to say something he had thought about carefully, and was going to say anyway with no performance in it, no practiced delivery. Just the plain intent of a man who has learned that some things have to be said out loud to be real. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, not because of the ranch or the ledgers or any of the practical things that brought you here." He stopped. "I want to ask you to stay because this is your home. Because you made it that. Because I look at this land, and I can't see it without seeing your fingerprints on it, and I don't want to." He paused. "And because I love you, which I understand is a thing I should have found a way to say before now." She looked at him for a long moment. The land was bright after the rain. The creek was running full. "You're not a man who says things before he means them," she said. "So I don't fault the timing. Do you?" he started. Yes, she said. Quiet. Certain. No hesitation, because she had stopped pretending it wasn't true somewhere around the third month and had simply been waiting for the right moment to let it stop being only hers. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. His grip was the same as everything else about him, steady and certain and not going anywhere. They stood like that for a while on the porch of a ranch that had almost been lost, looking at land that had almost been taken in a life that neither of them had chosen for the right reasons and had somehow arrived at the right place anyway. 1 year later, the Callahan Ranch ran more cattle than it had at any point in its history. The north section carried a second herd. Tom Briggs was foreman. Gus had officially retired, but continued to arrive every morning at the same hour and drink coffee in the kitchen and dispense observations that were technically unsolicited and universally correct. Preach had taken on an apprentice who did not yet quote scripture under pressure, but showed promise. Abigail managed the business operations and had extended her accounting work to 3 neighboring properties whose owners had asked quietly and specifically for her help. She had developed a contract template that 2 county agricultural associations had adopted as a standard document. A woman in Carbon County had written to ask her advice about a disputed grazing lease. She answered every letter. Mrs. Geary had her water rights reinstated in October of that year, following a territorial court review of Hale's original proceedings. Luke rode to Carbon County for the ruling and was there when she received the news, and he wrote to Abigail that evening from a hotel room in Rawlins and told her that Mrs. Geary had sat very still for a moment after hearing the decision and then said out loud to no one in particular, "I knew that woman would see to it." He said he had not corrected her. Abigail read that letter 3 times. The women of Harwick who had whispered in the general store now greeted her by name. The men at the feed store who had speculated about the marriage's collapse had the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who have been wrong publicly and know it. Commissioner Aldred had cited the Callahan hearing twice in subsequent county proceedings as an example of effective lay presentation of legal evidence without naming her directly. But the county was small, and everyone knew. She did not need them to know. But she noticed that she no longer needed to not need it, which was its own kind of freedom. On an evening in the second summer, she was in the garden when Luke came out and sat on the porch step and watched her work the way he had taken to doing in the evenings when the day was done and the ranch was quiet. "Vaught sent the final filed copies," he said. "The boundary documentation is on permanent record at the county and territorial level." "Good," she said without looking up. "He also sent a note," Luke said. He said you were the most thorough client correspondent he'd encountered in 40 years of survey work, and that if you ever wanted to train as a land agent, you should write to him. She stopped, looked up. "He said that," "Word for word," Luke said. "I can show you the letter." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and felt the particular, still unfamiliar sensation of being seen clearly by the world, and finding that the world saw something worth seeing. "Tell him thank you," she said, "and tell him I have enough work." Luke smiled. It was the full version, the one that took over his whole face, and that she had learned was rarer and more valuable for being rare. "I'll tell him," he said. She went back to the garden. He stayed on the step. The sun went down over the Wyoming land that belonged to both of them now, in every way that mattered, and the creek ran on in the long summer dark, clear and undisputed, following its ancient course toward everything still ahead. Luke Callahan had ridden into Harwick to find a solution, and had come home with something he had stopped believing existed. Abigail Harper had signed her name with a shaking hand and walked into a borrowed life, and had built it with her own hands, and her own mind, and her own stubborn refusal to believe that a woman like her had no place worth standing in, into something that was entirely and irrevocably hers. He had thought he was saving the ranch. She had thought she was only surviving. They had both been wrong, and neither of them had ever been more grateful for anything in their lives.